Hi, this is Allan McKay, and I wanted to welcome you to the very first video of this new course I've put together. We're going to be covering a lot throughout this course, and I'm extremely excited to see what you can do. Over the next 7 videos, we'll be doing everything from animation and rendering, and of course, particles, fluids, and other effects. More importantly, we're going to focus on going through a real production pipeline and using the same steps and decision making that I use when doing shots myself and supervising other effects artists and technical directors. In this video, we're going to initially set up our shot and prepare ourselves for the entire course, but properly setting everything up in a way that's intelligent and thoughtful, putting in the time to do things the right way like a real production. It's vital for the success of our work, as well as minimizing mistakes down the line. Not only are we going to be setting everything up and begin to block out our animation and controls, but also build our first effects pass, which is a volumetric plasma effect, the core element that a lot of the other effects will be driven from. I'm really excited for this, as well as to see what you can do. You can always leave comments below this video, as well as post links to your work. This is your chance to interact with everyone else who's going through the training, as well as myself. I'll be regularly commenting on everyone's work and offering advice, as well as just being really excited to see your work and how it improves over these lessons. So let's get started. Hi everyone, this is Allan McKay. So welcome to the beginning of this training, and we're going to be doing a lot. We're going to be going through from scratch, setting up our shot and working with it, building everything up. So to begin, one of the things that we're going to do is just set a directory to put all of this in. So this is our start file, Plasma Blast start file. Okay, really simple. And what we want to do is we want to store this in a directory that we're going to be working out of. And typically, this would be something that we want to put some thought into the structure of it and everything that we intend to do for it. So one thing that we do inside of my mentorship is we have a tool that we've developed, and I won't go into how to write this right now, but the main thing is just I'm going to demonstrate the structure and the workflow. So 2 different things here that we can do. One is, let's name the project. So we're going to call this Plasma Blast, okay? And we're going to open the directory once it's done. So click that, and as we can see here, it's built in my project directory, Plasma Blast. And the directory structure usually is going to be assets, which is going to be any assets that I'm going to use here, like caches, things like that. IO is typically anything coming in from my clients, which in this case is me, so we don't need to worry about that, but I'll store everything dated in there, and that way I know that whenever I need to track down something, I know the exact date of when it came in and everything else. Outgoing is anything I'm sending to the client. Maps, HDRI, textures, things like that. Production is going to be more producer related, so bids, review documentation with the client, anything like that. And then shots is where all of our stuff will lurk. Okay, so in this case, let's create a shot. And again, this is something that I've got tools developed to do all this. In this case, I want this to go from 0 to 238 centimeters. We're going to work in effects. And then if I go down here, go like Call of Duty, Game of Thrones, Magician, Plasma Blast, sorry. So here, let's just call this Plasma, and we can create this. So all I'm doing is I'm choosing the frame length to be that, working in centimeters. I'm choosing effects to create this shot, and Plasma Blast is the project, and then sequence 1, shot 1, and the pass is going to be Plasma. Okay, so click Create. And now we can see we've automatically saved this out as Plasma Blast. Sequence 1, Shot 1. Plasma is the effects. Version 1, Take 1. All that stuff automatically. So again, going back in this directory, I can see that in shots, we got 0101, Comp, Effects, Plasma, and it's stored in there. On top of that, if we go in here, it's all set up with V-Ray. The render resolution, the script automatically sets that up, so that's one thing we'll need to change. is the aspect ratio. So this is important, is that this is based on the camera, which is 2560 by 1350. Let's lock that, and then let's just drop this down from there to 960 by 506. So in other words, we're working with that aspect ratio, and we can go up to the full resolution later when we want to, but for now we're going to work at that resolution. Okay, so that's the one important thing to think about right now. And obviously the script also, I haven't actually done that yet, is it sets up our output directory. Okay, so it's also created in the render folder the directory structure of where we're going to save it and all that good stuff. So I figured I'd mention that just because I want to more walk through the typical workflow that, you know, in terms of directory structure, things like that. It's important to set this up correctly. Otherwise, you know, you don't want to be hunting around for files later on. It's better to work in a real production environment. And this is one based on working at studios like Allan, Blur, and a lot of other bigger studios that typically these directory structures mimic that kind of workflow. So the only thing that you need to do on your end is make sure you save it in a sensible directory structure similar to the tool that I use to develop this. And like I said, that's just a tool inside of my mentorship that we learn pretty much the first week. Is how to build something where, you know, we never have to save a file again. We never have to render to a directory again. We can automate all of that stuff. But the important thing is also to set up your aspect ratio to mimic the image plate, which we're going to set up next. So for now, all we've done is set up our render resolution. We have our LiDAR scan here, which is of a parking garage. So this was all scanned so it matches accurately with the background plate. And the background plate, let's bring that in next. So this is just part of setting everything up. We need to set the output resolution, directories, all that good stuff. Set up, I'm just clicking the layers here to pop this over here, and the material editor here. So I work in the compact version, not the slate. You can work whichever way you like. I just still prefer this. I love a node-based workflow. I love Hypershade and Maya, but yeah, just when it comes to Max, I just kind of have been conditioned to work this way, and for what I need to do, it works great. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to say get material, and let's just pick a bitmap. Film safes aren't on. In other words, this here. Just go to show safes, and that way it's just cropping it to the correct safety of the frame, which just for what we're doing just helps to make sure that it's matching the aspect ratio correctly. But yeah, this is it. This is our environment. We can scrub through, we can see what we got. Now, the big plan with this is that we wanted to set this up where everything is correctly in the right layers, and we're just going to go through the process like we would in a real production, and then we're going to start building our elements. Okay, so right now this is a bit sloppy. It merged in a bunch of stuff from the original layers I had them in. So let's just get everything. I think the easiest way is just to select by name, and then we can just select, everything, and we'll just make sure that the default, is the active layer. So just click that little blue icon, and then we can just say add to active layer, and that way everything is where it should be in the beginning. Now let's just set up some layers. So with nothing selected, I'm going to create a layer called effects. Then we have environment, and we have our camera. Let's create another one. We'll call this lights, and we'll also have one called misc for miscellaneous, and that just means junk, you know, any leftover stuff. So with effects, in here I'm going to store all of my effects elements, okay? And we want to try and keep this as neat and organized as possible. So in this case, just to go through our scene for a moment, we have this object, which is our LiDAR scan. All right. And what I want to do is I want to get the LiDAR. I'm going to drag it into environment because it's our environment. Now I'm going to click the little eyeball just to hide it. Get our camera. I'm going to drag that into camera. Hide that. And then we have world and scene. Now these two elements, you can't really see them. They're just null objects, okay? So depending on whether you're coming from Houdini, Cinema 4D, Maya, like in Maya, these would be a locator. You know, it's just all it is a null point. So these were just here because they're parenting everything because I scaled up my scene. I like to keep everything organized in a way that I can reverse the scale if I ever wanted to. So these are MISC. They're items we don't really need, so I'm just going to drop them into there, and we can hide that because this is all junk. It's stuff that we don't need. But we do need our camera and our environment. Those are the two key things that we want. Now, the other thing that I just want to mention is that one of the most common things I see in production is artists will work away on a shot and they'll accidentally nudge the frame, and it might just be slight. But what ends up happening is they go and they work on all their effects, they render everything out, and it takes days to render all their effects. And then we get in the comp, and I'm reviewing shots, and I'm saying, why are the elements not lining up? And everyone's scratching their head trying to figure out, well, is the animation offset? Are the effects offset? Are the environment lighting offset? Where did things go wrong? And it ends up being another day of just trying to figure it out and then re-rendering everything once it's corrected. In other words, really simple mistakes like nudging your camera and then you continue to work away without realizing that your camera is offset happen all the time. So let's just select our camera. So I'm just going to click here, go down to select camera, go to link info, so hierarchy link info, and lock all of these. In other words, our camera is animated already, so we don't need to do any more work on it. Okay, so now I cannot scale it, I can't do anything to it, and that's good. It's protecting me from myself of ever making that mistake. Again, in the mentorship, we have tools that we've developed that, you know, a click of a button when a camera comes in, when it gets published, it automatically locks it all. In other words, when it gets handed over to other artists, no one but the original camera animator or previs artists can actually make adjustments to it without needing to manually go in and change that. And it's the same thing with effect simulations, with a lot of stuff. You don't want anyone to accidentally overwrite your stuff. So that's another thing I just wanted to mention ahead of time, is it happens all the time, and that little mistake can cost days of rendering and reworking and having to figure out like who went wrong, who made the mistake, and so that way you can reverse the issue. So in this case now, you know, we're 10 minutes in, but we've set up our directory. I've explained a lot of kind of behind the scenes how we would approach things, but now the key thing is that I want to start to build out the effects. And in this particular lesson, I want to initially do all the animation blocking. In other words, I want to figure out, okay, we have a sphere or an orb, and it's going to start to build up, build up, build up. And at a certain frame, it's going to release all that energy. It's going to burst and explode and create a lot of destruction and other effects as well. I realize that this is pretty dense right now. So, and this is actually the low res LiDAR scan. There's one that's very dense, which I'm not providing just because I don't think we need it right now. But what I will do is I'm just going to go on the modify panel. So selecting the LiDAR, go to modify. I'm going to put in, clicking here, I'm going to choose optimize, not open subdiv, because that will do the opposite. And that way we're just kind of quickly done a optimization on our mesh. And the good thing about Max's modify stack is it's completely reversible. I can turn that off. It's kind of like Maya's history or Houdini's workflow, where, you know, you've got your history of items that you can enable and disable. Maya's isn't as flexible. I really like Max's for that sake of kind of having a linear history that you can reorder and do things with. But at least now we're not looking at as much geometry. When it comes to rendering, if we want, we can turn it back on, but that should be fine. And so the next step is, let's start to set up our effects. I want to initially block out the animation. just having like an orb, like a sphere, and having it kind of slightly grow and then explode. Okay, so in the beginning, let's create a new layer. So let's go to effects. Let's make this active. I'm going to make sure nothing's selected. I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm just going to call this orb, O-R-B for orb, and you know, just like a plasma orb, something like that. And in here, I'm going to create a sphere. Oops. And let's just position this somewhere over here. And the whole idea is that this is going to build up over time, so we don't need it to be initially too big. I'm going to call this master sphere. Okay, so that way we know that this is the top node that's going to drive a lot of what we're doing. And we want to do this sensibly. We don't want to just create lots of junk. We want to have certain things that control everything, because all it takes is the director, the client, your supervisor, whoever, to come along and say, hey, I want this to animate for a few more frames. Actually, this frame initially was going to be 190 frames. I decided later that I really liked it. I wanted to extend it 48 frames roughly. And because of that, you know, if I had all these separate objects and things doing their own thing, then it would be a lot more work. But instead, I just had to go to one node, and I just put like relative repeat on the animation curve, and it just progressively continued where it was going. And then I extended the frame length, and I was done. It didn't mean that I needed to do much more than that, rather than it being like a headache, which if you're not careful with how you plot out your scenes, then it can become problematic very quickly. Okay, so we don't need the camera right now. It's going to hide that layer. But with this, let's just quickly animate this. All right, so initially, for 120 frames, I just want to have this kind of scale up. In fact, one last thing. Let's do two quick things. I'm going to go to Customize, Preferences. If you're working in effects, one of the key things I always change if we go to the Animation tab is Set Defaults, Bezier, and or Bezier. I'm Australian, so I'm going to butcher any pronunciation. So one of the key things that I do is I always bring it back to the top one. Now, in Max 5, which was 2003, I think. Just trying to think. Yeah, 2003, Max 5 came out. They introduced this other animation curve, which is really great for, it's kind of like F-curves. It's really great for doing animation, because Bezier is kind of pretty old school and can be problematic. However, the way it defaults, and I wish I had my Wacom plugged in right now, the way that it defaults, if you were to set just 2 key points, it kind of creates a bit of a bell curve, and it's not what we want, because we need to fix that every time. So instead, by setting these to the top ones, for effects, I find this to be the best thing to do, and that way there's no unpredicted results later on, like you get something to scale, and it scales a little bit, and then it speeds up and slows down again. It's very unpredictable. So this is better for if you're just doing 2 or 3 keyframes on an object. You'll get a linear line or the correct kind of bell curve you might want if you're ramping things up. The other thing is in viewports, just make sure you have update background while playing, and that checkbox will allow you to scrub and see your background as you're playing through it. Okay, so those are the 2 things to worry about right now. Finally, one last thing I'm going to do is go to Rendering Environment. For now, let's just right-click and choose Cut to get rid of the background out of there. And then we'll just set this back to like a solid color. Okay. I hate to say it, but Max has had a bug for a long time, which most people aren't aware of, where if you have anything animated in here, even if it's not turned on, it loads at every frame, and it's really frustrating. So now you'll notice it's lightning fast. Okay, now I'm going to go to frame 120. I'm going to hit Auto key. I'm going to choose to scale this up. Let's get to about there. And then what I want is for this to explode very quickly. Okay. So let's say by frame 135, that's where I want this to really explode. I'm going to make it hit the camera by that stage. So about there. Okay, so turn auto key off. Let's go into the curve editor. I'm very hotkey driven. In fact, I'm useless without hotkeys just because I've been using the same hotkeys since before Macs ever came out, like back in 3ds-DOS and Softimage on the SGI. So yeah, I've done talks before where I didn't have hotkeys and I literally had to ask the crowd, like, how do I do like a preview or simple things like that, just because I rarely use the interface itself. Okay, so now I'm just going to click the fit and view, these two here, and we can see that we do have this warped curve because I've set 3 keyframes. If I were just setting 2, this is what I'm talking about. We just get a linear line, which is great. But with 3, we get a bit of an awkward thing here just because this is such a dramatic curve. So in the beginning, let's set these two to be linear. So I'm just selecting these 2 points, making it linear. And then we got this one here, which I'm going to create another point. We could just adjust the tangents, but I'm going to instead add a point, and that way I can kind of get a little bit of a ramp up happening. And then with this, I just right clicked on that. I'm going to change this to the original curve. And at least that way, whoops, at least that way we got a little bit of a curve happening there. So I don't mind it just kind of quickly animating out. If we needed to, we can definitely adjust that, but you know, I don't mind it. Sorry, I'm just trying to deselect everything. So it's up to you what you want to do. I mean, you could do that with one curve if you like wanted to adjust the tangents to get that, but the whole point is we're just trying to get something that kind of quickly, you know, it scales out over time, and then 135 it hits, and it goes up here. Finally, with this curve, let's make that linear. And I'm also going to click on the out of range types and choose relative repeat. Yeah, it's not quite giving me what I want, so I'll add one more key point. We'll make that linear as well. So we might need to do a little bit of adjusting here, but the whole point is that we just, you know, want to have this continue doing what it's doing. This guy here, I'm just bringing it back to being Bezier. Sorry, I'm bringing it back to being the regular curve that we had before. But something like that. I mean, I don't care too much. It's more about the initial pulse. So we want it to get to 120. So here we go, and then bang. So initially it's scaling, and then we get that blast, and then it continues to scale in a pretty linear fashion beyond that. Okay, so pretty straightforward, but just kind of gives us something to initially work with. So we want this to build up, build up, build up, and then at the peak of it, it explodes and we get that big burst. If we wanted to make this get bigger, it's really just a matter of getting this whole entire thing and just shifting it up. No, it's not the most perfect curve, but you get the idea. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I just wanted to kind of point out the general workflow. You know, we're animating a sphere, but timing is critical, because if you don't get the timing right, it's not going to have that feeling of impact, of that energy dispersing, and everything is going to be wrong. Okay. I find the more that I supervise artists, the more that I find that it's usually the fundamentals about timing and weight and just hitting the right beats that people kind of overlook. They're too focused on trying to make something visually look complicated and have a lot going on. And because they miss the most pivotal, simple things like getting your gravity right or things like that, it doesn't matter how cool your effects are, they're going to just look weak. They're not going to look right. So it's really critical to get it right the first time. All right, so that being said, that to me is fine. From this point, let's start to build this out. I want this to be the base of our effect. Okay, so initially, there's going to be a lot of different layers that make this up, and this is going to be the core element. It's going to be the one that's probably the most at the background. It's going to really give it the volume it needs and fill that negative space. But from there, we're going to layer in all these intricate secondary layers, which will give it life and give it a lot of interesting motion. So this one is really critical, but at the same time, it's probably the easiest one for us to do. Now, the way that I intend to do it is we initially got our sphere, which is our master sphere. I'm going to build now a couple of additional layers, and these are going to be the core of it all. Okay, so we'll call this one the volume, I guess, and the volume is going to be the thing that's going to make it all up. Okay, so with this already made, I'm going to create another sphere. I'm not duplicating the one we currently have because it's got all the animation curves. So what I want is to get a new sphere, and I click Align, and I'm just going to drop it in the very center. We could click center just to make sure. And I can make this a little bit bigger if I want to, whatever I want to do, but this is going to be one of two spheres that we'll make, and they'll control the core volume of our effect. So with this one still active, I'm going to make it a little bit smaller than the master sphere, and I'm just going to freeze that. Freezing, if you need to know, is just display freeze selected, and all that does is it make it so I can't select it. All right, so with the sphere, let's call this VolumeSphere 1. Okay, and so VolumeSphere 1, I'm going to put in the modify panel here. I'm just going to put a noise modifier on it, and I'm going to set this to 20 fractal and 10 by 10. I just want something that's a little bit irregular, because right now, having a perfect sphere is going to look very CG and very, well, I mean, this is always going to look CG. It's kind of more sci-fi-ish, but yeah, it's just more irregular. So we've created that. I'm going to select my master sphere. I'm going to right-click, go Object Properties, and choose Renderable Off. And that way I can't render this object. It won't show up. But the master sphere, if we want, we could do the same. I'm going to go Object Properties, Renderable, turn that off too. So neither of these are renderable, okay? Now, let's start to create this effect. Let's start to build up something that's going to look really cool. I'm using V-Ray, and so V-Ray has V-Ray volume fog. And so we can see we're using V-Ray. I got V-Ray 3.6. Should be upgrading. But I'm just going to go to Render Environment. We bring this back up again. Now, we have atmospherics in here. I'm going to choose Add, and I'm going to choose to have the V-Ray Environment Fog. If I drop that in, scroll down the bottom, and I can pick our VolumeSphere 1. Now, if I render this, there's no lights in the scene, so yeah, it won't look too attractive, but we can see that this has created this shape here. Let's go back to our sphere for a moment. I'm going to go down to sphere, so drop down from noise to sphere. Let's double the amount of segments, and that will make it a little bit less polygonal. But so far, we got that, okay? So the next thing that I want to do is let's just drop a light into our shot. So I'm going to go to lights, make that active. Go to lights in here, standard, omni, and the top view. I'm just going to drop a light into the shot. In the front view, I'm just going to move it in the center, or you can align it however you want to do it. But the whole point is that we have an omni light in there. Omni light is just like a point light in Maya. It's just a omnidirectional light. I don't want to do too much with this. I just want to go intensity and put this up to like 6 or 6.5, something like that. And click lights and add that light in. Say turn that off, so it's just using 1. All right, now it's going to be a bit brighter because the multiplier, the strength of the light is quite strong. Okay, so there's other things we can do. I could set this to have a less distance, which will make it more opaque. In other words, the more distance, the more visibility. Sorry, the visibility. Getting tongue-tied. There will be in the shot. So for now, let's just set it at 10. The key thing is that right now this is just an opaque fog, like volumetric fog. What I really like about the environment fog in V-Ray is that we can use a density map, okay? And I've used this style for so many different movies over the years, and if you look at the very first shot in Superman Returns, not the greatest movie, but when we have Krypton explode, sorry, the sun explodes and destroys Krypton, in that moment, that was mostly the same kind of approach to what we're doing in the shot. I used a lot of particle flow, and I used afterburn combustion, which is identical to V-Ray volume fog. So in other words, I used a 3D density map to create all these different layers and build that all up. Okay, and interestingly, when Krypton is destroyed, if you look really closely, you'll see a 3ds Max teapot as one of the pieces of debris that comes out of the planet. So I kind of snuck that in for fun. Now, if I go back into my material editor, which is this guy here, they keep changing the icon. I'm going to go down to here. I'm just going to make this, what are we calling this? VolumeSphere 1. And we'll call this _ big, because this is going to be more of a bigger effect. And then I'm going to click diffuse and type in noise. So we have a noise map. I'm going to set this to fractal. And we'll just set this to be about 10. All right, and let's just drop the noise here into density as an instance. Okay. So when we do that, now we'll see there's a little bit of breakup in there, not much, but a little bit. So just for a second, let's play with the high and low values and bring this up so we can see it better. Initially, these are set at 1 and 0, so in other words, there's a lot of range. In other words, and again, I'll make this really big for a sec. There's not much negative space. So in other words, it's going to still be pretty consistently white, which means opaque in this case. So what I can do, and this is just purely to demonstrate this, is I can bring the low value up, which will make the darker areas more dominant. In other words, a lot of negative space. But then the white values we can clamp or compress down as well to make them brighter. Okay. Now if I run this, we'll see that there's starting to be a bit of breakup. Let's set the size back to 10. And then you can see there's more breakup. And then obviously we can get more and more and more. The cool thing about this is that it's completely volumetric. In other words, it's 3D. So when I render this, I can then move around it, and it's actually 3D that's being created. Like it's a 3D volume. Okay. So what I want to do is, instead of doing the high and low here, I can do something a little bit more interesting with the output. So if we go down to output, we can see kind of like a color ramp here, and it's called enable color map. Kind of like adjusting curves in Photoshop or color lookup in Nuke, color curves in Fusion. So enabling this under the output rollout, we got 0 is 0, so in other words, black is black, 1 or white is at the peak here. So I'm going to set these both to black, so nothing's showing up. But then what I'll do is I'm going to click on the create point. I'm going to create 3 points. And because this isn't the most elegant kind of view to work from, I'm going to just click the middle one and click 0.5. And that's going to center it. So 0, 1, so this is the direct middle, 0.5. And I'll set the value to 1. And already we can see we have kind of like an electrical pattern showing up. Okay, so now with these guys, I don't know, I'll do like 0.55, 0.45, something like that. Okay, now this is giving me something a bit more interesting. So if I render this out now, we can see that's looking a little bit more kind of electric-y, if that's a word. And in other words, we're just getting the extreme peak at the center, and then it falls off. So we're getting those kind of fine lines. Okay, so we can definitely play with that. There's a few things I wouldn't mind doing. One is setting the fractal levels to 5, and that's just giving it more octaves. So in other words, it's giving more detail to the noise. You know, lower the value, the more simple the curves are going to be. So 5 is a good one. I feel to kind of get a little bit of breakup and kind of secondary breakup in there. Now, with this curve, I just right-clicked and chose do a Bezier corner, and I'm just pulling these down to get a very sharp curve. And that way we're seeing a lot more definition in there already. So again, this is something I've been doing for years, and that's why I thought it'd be fun to kind of approach this, because I've been doing this stuff, and for me, this is really simple stuff, but I sometimes forget that not everyone has been doing this sort of thing, and I figure it's worthwhile mentioning it. Now, I like that layout, and rather than kind of playing with this anymore, I'd rather just put this up to like 1.5, 1.25, and that's going to push the whites even stronger. But then if I want a bit more negative space, I can pull the darks down as well. And that way we get a lot more breakup, see? So that's kind of, by pulling the offset, we're offsetting the range, and that's going to make it a lot more negative space. Otherwise, it looks like that. So pulling this down, what I have is like 0.35, something like that. That's giving it more that sort of effect. Now, if I wanted these to have a bit more range, I can pull these back up. We get more fall off in the edges, but the whole point is that now we're getting something a bit more interesting. And again, this is completely 3D. Okay, so these are just procedural maps that we're building. One thing I'd like to do at this point is go to frame 100, and let's just animate our phase to 1.5. So in other words, I'm saying that it's going to phase 1.5 times over 100 frames, and that way this pattern is going to animate over time. You can see that it's phasing around. Now, the other thing I'm going to do, just because I'm lazy and this makes it a lot easier, is with VolumeSphere still selected, I'm going to apply this, and that's why I made it a shader opposed to a map. I'm going to apply it to the object, just because it's the easiest way for me to go in the curve editor and have it automatically bring up the map. And so with the phase, all I'm going to do is do a relative repeat, and that way this is just going to continue on forever. Now, you might notice I'm doing relative repeats everywhere. It's just because I want this to be set up in a way that if I wanted to change the timing, if I wanted to change the frame length, anything that I wanted to do, all of this is going to automatically update. So I'm trying to think ahead, knowing that if I want to do something, I can adjust the curve here, and it's going to infinitely adjust. So I'm just trying to be smart about this. Now, going back in, I like the pattern. I think there's more we can do with this. Let's set the distance to 3, which is going to make it more opaque. Let's set the color to blue. And already that's looking kind of interesting. Now with the emission, I'm going to set that to be a brighter blue. So I'm just going to copy and paste this in, and then let's just try and make this more washed out. All right, so now that's pretty extreme. So I'm going to get my noise, I'm going to drag that into the emission as an instance, and I'll drop it down to 75. That way it's blending between this and the black and white map, which will give us something interesting. Right now it's a bit extreme, so let's just change this to add density to fall off and blend, and that way we're getting a, it's just nicer. The other one multiply. It's exactly it multiplies on itself, and so that way it gets very intense. This is going to be a bit more toned back. We can still give it a bit of fall off, and that's just making the edges be a bit softer as well, because we want the center to be the main focus. I think besides that, we can give samples. Texture samples was put at the 6, so there's going to be less noise around here. The other thing is the step size. I'm going to bring down a little bit. So the step size this is a volume. So in other words, each time it samples through the volume, it's stepping 1, 2, 3. So depending on the size, that's how many units essentially between each sample. So the lower it is, the more times it's going to step or through the Raymark shader. So by setting it higher, it's going to render better, but it's going to sample less times. It can look kind of chalky and opaque and not very soft. Whereas default is 4, we're setting it to 3. I don't think there's really too much more that we want to do here. We wanted to set this up to have a light, so that way we can use that to control the opaqueness, like the density of it. And then, obviously this controls, oops, wrong view. They'll control like how opaque or transparent we get. So the shorter the range, kind of like Raymarching, the shorter it is, the less distance that you can see inside of it. So if we want to make it softer, we can bring that up. If we want to make the colors more intense, we can do that with the light. And then finally, if we want to make the edges softer, keep in the wrong view, we can do that here, okay? But like I said, what did I have this as? Like 2, I think. Yeah, so those are the basic things that we want to work with. So it's pretty straightforward, but we're going to get a nice kind of electrical effect. And I think that in the beginning, this works really well. I don't really like the angle too much. I'm going to try rotating this around. Again, it's 3D, so we can do whatever we want to it. I can even do that. I actually kind of liked what we had there. So now that we have this, what I want to do is create a second one that's more high frequency. It's going to fill in some of the negative space and kind of give a nicer fall off to everything around it. Okay, so we're going to duplicate what we currently have. In fact, I'm just going to right click, clone as copy, and call this VolumeSphere 2. Make sure we're in the correct layer. All right, and then this one, we're going to sphere, bring the radius up bigger. And go to noise. Let's just change the seed of this just to something random. Doesn't look too weird. Bring it down a little bit. Okay. In fact, I'm going to go back up here. I'm going to bring the scale down as well. I want to just make this feel a little bit more high frequency. Okay. And we can hide these because we're rendering the environment in here. So we don't actually need the geometry. We're not rendering anything there. But for now, I'm going to click add. In fact, let's just call this VolumeSphere 1. I'm going to add another one. Let's just copy the colors in, because I want this to feel like it's all the same body. It's just an extension of it. So just copy those colors in. And with this one, let's drag the noise map into the density as an instance and the fog emission. This time I'm going to set the fog emission to 50, so it's not going to rely as much on the map, which means it'll fill in some of the negative space. And then with the fog emission color, yeah, I feel like that should be fine. Let's just try and render this. I know the density is going to be wrong. Let's just bring it down to 10 to start with. Oh, and it might help if we actually select our sphere. Otherwise, it's going to apply it to the whole scene. So I just selected the sphere, and let's choose our light. And choose use lights off. Use all lights off. Okay, so now we have something that's much bigger around the core. I might actually go back to my VolumeSphere really quick. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger as well. Okay, but overall this is fine. What I will do is, let's make this a little bit more transparent. We'll set it to 15. I'm going to do some more subdivs just to help with the sampling, because I know that I'm jumping ahead of myself here, but I know that this is going to require more sampling because it's going to be more transparent, and it's also going to be a more high frequency map. Okay, so I'll get into that in a moment. I'm going to set my step size down as I did before. Samples, everything else will keep the same. The main thing is we're going to add the density fall off and do a blend exactly like we did before, and we'll just do that fall off of 2. Now this should look kind of similar, just more transparent. Now the key difference is that I don't want to use the current map, so I'm going to get this whole entire map and drag it across. I'm going to call this one too small. I'm going to go into the actual map. I should probably name these. I'll call it VolumeSphere too small map. I'll do the same for here, just so that way at least they're named. I guess that I should be clean about this big map. Okay, so in here though, I guess the key thing is that I want the size to be much smaller. Okay, and I might give this a few more octaves. I'm going to make it a bit more frequent there, but by making it smaller. And sorry, I gotta actually drop this into here. This map is going to be a lot more high frequency, as we can see. So we have the big, more dense electrical maps, and then around it we have this kind of softer fall off, okay, which works pretty well. I don't like the shape of this though. You can see there's physically a big arc there, so I'm going to bring the scale down smaller, and that way it's less repetitive, and then play with the seed a little bit. There we go. Just something random that just doesn't look too weird. And that's another thing too, is that if there are any, if the geometry is flipping in any areas, it can get a bit weird. So trying to think. What I might do is put a relax modifier on this, and it's just going to tone it back a little bit, because I'm not trying to get the detail from the actual shape. I just wanted this not to be a perfect sphere. So, you know, I'd rather this not have any weird flipped surfaces. I think there's a few maybe there. I could be wrong about that, but either way, you know, putting a relax modifier on it is just going to get it to go back to its simple form, but I'm just trying to get any aggressive kind of shape changes, directions to be a bit more ironed out and simplified. Okay, but that's good. That's giving us something to work with. The other thing is that I've got the display with the gamma up. So I'm just turning this little curve off, so that way it's displaying as sRGB, and that way we're seeing all the colors a bit more saturated and a bit more how they'll look in comp. But I like that. I think that as a core element, that works really well. The key thing is that from here, we're going to have like particles swirling around it. We're going to have all these different elements that build it up, fluids, particles, you name it. So we just need this to be the base that is going to be sitting there, phasing around, doing its thing, and moving. And all the other layers will be layered on top of it. So right now it kind of looks a little bit simple, but this is like the base layer that we're going to build everything else on top of. So let's just look at rendering this out. If we wanted to render this element, just so we can take a look at it and see how it looks, let's just go in to here. I'm just going to do active time segment. No global illumination. We're not trying to render anything out. We're just doing it for a preview. If you want, you could choose like active render elements, render elements add, and choose V-Ray atmosphere. If another thing that we could do is right now we have this geometry. Let's set this up as a matte object. Okay, so I'm going to go back into my material editor, go back up here, I'm going to choose Get Material, do a V-Ray material, make the diffuse color black, apply it to that object, or you can just drag it on there if you want to, and then I'm going to right click, go V-Ray properties, and make sure this is matte object with a negative alpha contribution. It looks like I'd already done that, so you might need to, and then we can still have the shadows on. But now what's going to happen is when we render this, we can see that it's not showing up physically in the render. So I already had that set up when we merged it in, but just remember, if you were working from a raw brand new scene, this is what you'll be dealing with. Okay, so at least that way, I'm just rendering out our core element. And now I'm just going to choose where to save this to. The cool thing is, because I was using that script, it's automatically built my folders for me. So I just need to drop that in here, and I'm going to call this plasma dash, and then we'll call this orb. I'm going to change that from orb, by the way. We'll call it volume sphere, I guess. I'm not going to worry too much about the naming, but that should be fine. Camera, we'll turn on motion blur, just so as the camera shifts, there's a little bit of optical motion blur in there. And then let's just call this volume sphere to keep everything consistent. Okay. Now with the master sphere, I'm going to go back to effects. I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to call this effects controls. I'm going to drop that master sphere in there. Anything that is using helpers, stuff like that, I might want to add that in there just so it has that on top. Okay, so the other thing really important is let's go to the top view. With effects control still active, I'm going to go, and what I want to have is I want the sphere to have a little bit of rotation, just slight rotation. But I don't want that to be on the master sphere, because later I'm going to add other things in here, and I don't want them to have the rotation. But I want this to, just because phasing by itself would be kind of boring. So I'm going to go helpers, point, which is like a locator in Maya. Let's just drop this anywhere. Make sure cross is turned on. We'll bring the size up. Okay, so I'm going to click on align, and I'm going to align it to that sphere. Make sure it's in the pivot center. Okay. Now, let's just get rid of everything else for a second. All right, so all I've done is I created this locator. Make sure we're at frame 0, and I'm going to get my volume spheres, both of them here. I'm going to click on link. We'll click that padlock. This is my lazy way of doing this, because usually I'd select them, I have to choose the parent, blah, blah, blah. I'm just selecting both. I'm choosing selection lock, and that just means that wherever I'm in the scene, I can click it, which is, for me, it's a hotkey. It's my space bar. So it just makes it really easy, because I can just click both, hit there, click parent, and then drag it onto that locator. So just to recap, all I'm doing, I have these two volume spheres, and I just want to parent them onto, if I do select by name, onto this point. All right. So now they're not parented and they don't scale anymore. They're not parented to our master sphere. They're parented to this point. Oops. Okay, so there's the point. Now, what I can do on top of that is I can parent the point to our master sphere. Okay, so if we were to look at the hierarchy of this, all it is we have our spheres, they're parented to the point is parented to the master sphere. So now, if I want to, I can animate this. Let's just say 100 frames. I'm going to animate this just rotating a little bit. Let's give it a slight rotation. to 55 over 100 frames, and again, relative repeat. Now, all that's happening is that these volume spheres are now rotating over time, and they'll continue to rotate over time. If we were to look at the master sphere, it's not rotating at all. Okay, for isolate selection, you can see it's not rotating; it's just scaling up. Okay, so that's the reason we've done that. So that way, I have this point, and I'm going to call this volume sphere ROT for rotation, and it just means that now we have this kind of slightly rotating over time, as well as phasing in the shader. So that way, it's just going to be a little bit more interesting. Okay. Now, let's just render this out and take a look. But what we've done is we've built up a procedural 3D shader, which creates a pretty interesting pattern. The pattern itself is kind of phasing and moving around over time, but it's also rotating slightly as well, so there's a little bit of a shift over time. And then this effect, like I said, is going to be the core of everything, and then we're going to be layering all these other effects on top. Okay, so we'll be layering all these other effects on top of this as well. And so we need this to kind of look good in the beginning, but then obviously we're going to add more elements to it. Okay, so I'm going to render this out now, and let's take a look at the final result. Okay, so this is just a render preview. It's only 180 frames of it. I haven't rendered the entire thing yet, but I just want to showcase how it looks. Obviously, it gets a little bit ugly when it gets up here, and that's intentional. We're not worrying about this as a core element. When it gets up there, we're going to have a lot of other things going on. You can also see the alpha is not 100%. So if you look here, it's like 0.9. So there's obviously a lot of transparency in there as well. Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but if we were to drop this into the camera plate, we'd initially look at something, oops, like that. Okay, so that's just the two of them locked together. So here it is with the moving background and our element. So we can kind of see that this is the beginning. We obviously now have more and more elements to build, but now we have a 3D volumetric effect. And this is literally just a rough render. I can turn on a bit of post-processing, so just playing with contrast. Again, like I kind of rendered it out knowing that we'd have a lot of color range. Nothing's blown out white, nothing's blown out dark. So we've got a lot of range that we can pull apart. Adding glow and motion blur and everything else to it, we're getting something a bit more interesting like this. So we'll be getting into this later on. I'm not worrying about the the comp and everything else like that yet. I'm just showcasing how the element will look treated to give you a bit of an idea of what to expect. And you can start to use your imagination to kind of picture how all these elements together will start to build up. So obviously this is just one element out of, I think, 5 or 6 elements that we're building. Others are fluids or particles or other interesting things. So this element, though, I think it looks really cool. I think that for what it is, it's definitely giving a really cool result. It's got a lot of intricate motion to it. From here, obviously, we would do things like a heat distortion in the background to kind of make everything displace around, interactive lighting. So having this as a light source that will actually illuminate the environment. The cool thing is that this isn't just like a 3D track that we have like a flat ground plane for. We have the physical LiDAR scan of this. So it means that we could light this correctly and have all the information we need to be able to have the shadows cast and everything, the global illumination, having everything be illuminated from our effect. So when we get to that stage, all of this is going to be reflecting on the ground. It's going to look really cool. We'll have a lot going on. In addition to that, like I said, we'll have like a lot of other layers, and we'll kind of build this up over time. So I think that this is a core element, is going to work really well. And of course, the next phase is to start building up the particle elements and all the other things that will make this effect look like the final result. So hopefully you got a lot from this. At the same time, like we're just been going through how to build up the base layers right now. This is the very beginning where you want to get all this stuff locked in, because like I said, in production, I see it all the time that people kind of race to getting the most complicated part going. And then as soon as someone starts talking about timing or placement, just simple things like that, it's so much more work to make adjustments later on. So it's better to be smart about what you're doing and build this up intelligently as we've been doing. Okay, so we've locked down the timing, we've locked down the position of where this is going to happen. We've got the initial base layer, which is enough that we can discuss this and say, okay, this looks good, this is going to work. Let's add all the intricate layers on top of this now to visually make it stand out, to visually be able to be captivating while this is telling the story. This is saying that we have this orb that's shifting and then building up to a certain point where eventually over 238 frames, it discharges and explodes and then creates this whole environment that we're immersed in. So in the next lesson, we'll continue on and build up the other layers and elements that come into this. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this training. This is just the beginning and we have a lot of work ahead of us. But this element, as well as the work we've put in now, will set ourselves up for later being able to pull off much more complicated effects, as well as continually progressing through the upcoming lessons. In the next video, we'll continue to build on our work so far by creating another critical element, which will be using fluid to simulate an electrical visceral effect using VolumeSphere. Now, although I am using VolumeSphere for this, this can be done in Maya's Fluids, PyroFX in Houdini, Turbulence FD in Cinema 4D. The concepts are exactly the same, so if you're up for the challenge and want to use another software package, by all means, do it. I use 3ds Max for a lot of my work, as does ILM, Scanline, VFX, Blur Studio, and many other leading visual effects studios for production. Although I regularly work in other software packages as well, and tend to find the workflow process identical. So what you learn in one package can easily be applied to another. And in the meantime, take a moment to share this training with others using the share button below, which will share the original link which you signed up with, allanmckay.com/plasma. It would mean the world to me if you can take a moment to share this. All of this training is free and is my way to give back to the industry and give back to the community. However, it would mean the world to me to get others to benefit from this training as well. So if you can take a second to share, I will be forever grateful and buy you a beer. That's it for now. Keep an eye out on your inbox over the next coming days for video 2.